Hello again. I am Jade Valkyrie, one of the co-hosts here at Area of Effect. Next up, we have our UX and UI panel. Our guests today come from a wide range of AAA companies within the gaming industry and are all experts in their field. Have burning questions about how to start your career in UX or UI? We do have some questions on deck, but you can answer your questions for a QA session to be answered at the end of the panel by typing in command question in Twitch chat, which will bring up a form for you to submit your questions. Those in Discord can be on the lookout for this forum panel and announcements. So, without further ado, let's get started. Can each of you give a brief summary of who you are and what company you work for? Let's start with Elisa.
Hi, I'm Elisa Bishop. I currently work as a senior UI UX artist at Pokemon Company International. I have a history of mostly doing UI art. Just recently kind of got more into UX, and that's me.
And then next, we'll have Ashley.
Hi, I'm Ashley Olmstead, and I am currently at Electronic Arts. I'm a senior UX designer.
And Hawk.
Hi, I'm Hawk. I'm a senior UX designer at Riot Games, working on platform tech. And before I was at Riot, I worked for Blizzard for a number of years.
And last but not least, Hasiba.
Hi, I'm Hasiba. I'm a UI designer at Blizzard, currently working on Hearthstone. I've been here since the beginning of the lockdown was my first day, so my entire career on Hearthstone has been completely remote, but it's been cool. I've worked in video games my whole career in both game websites as well as game UI.
And so for our first question, and this is kind of like for the chat who might not necessarily know what UX and UI is. So can you describe UX and UI for the uninitiated? And we'll start with Hasiba for this one.
Yeah, so UX UI is sometimes really hard to describe because you do a lot of things that don't really go noticed by the average user or player. And often it can be kind of considered like games have so many different parts of it, and I like to think of UI kind of like stitching all these disciplines together into like a cohesive quilt. But pretty much we're focused on things um, like say for instance you're thinking about buttons. For UI, we think of the design, the art, and the implementation. So for the design of a button, you kind of ask, why do we need the button? What buttons do we need? What are the different states of that button? The other aspect of UI is kind of the art and visual side of it, which is what do the buttons actually look like and feel like, and what kind of interactions and animations kind of come out of it. And then finally, the implementation side is really big in UI, where we kind of consider like the final polish of the whole product. So, say for instance, you kind of get to see in the actual game itself, now that we've designed and decorated this button, how does it actually feel in the game setting? What are all the edge cases that we've got? What is the timing of the button press? Does it feel buggy? Does it feel weird? How can we refine that and make it really a AAA experience?
And Hawk, can you give us that UX perspective?
Yeah, sure. So for UX, we spend a lot of time thinking about we spend a lot of time thinking about what is it that the player, usually the player, is trying to do. What context are they in? Where does all this UI fall? Because really the UI components don't change that much from screen to screen. It's probably buttons, probably text, there's scrollable, there's forms, there's fields. They're all pretty much the same thing. But the way that we present them and the order that we present them and how we address the needs um, of the player and of the product itself, how we combine all that together is what makes UX. For me, what I spend a lot of time doing is balancing what does the company need out of this product, what does the game need out of this product, with more importantly, what is the player trying to do, what are they trying to achieve, and then I personally focus a lot on usability testing. So in using my testing players and testing them through our competitors and through our own products to figure out where can we improve our own work, and uh, make where can I steal things from other people, to be honest. uh, that's a big part of every designer's job. Everyone here on the panel is probably like, yes, thievery is good. Yes, evil fingers, Hasiba.
So yeah, the evil fingers, part of UX and UI, definitely for sure. Ashley, do you have anything to add?
No, I think everyone covered it pretty well. I think being UX focused, it's just our job to make sure that every intent that every field has is relayed and understood by the player and is the most optimal experience for that player. And sometimes often that problem is solved with UI, but there's also like other ways to solve the problem that we try to focus on too, and how to best optimize that just for the user, for the player.
Thank you. And our next question is, where do you go for UX or UI, or in Elisa's case, both, design inspiration? And we'll start with Elisa.
Honestly, other games. It's really bad. It was pretty common at my last company to be like, well, X game does this, so let's just play that for a little bit. I like looking at actually like motion graphics stuff in film industry, because even though a lot of that is kind of fakey, it still is a good visual inspiration for what things could be or how cool they could be. I have a background actually in graphic design, so actually a lot of graphic design kind of has a carryover, and the things happening there can kind of help you. So honestly, it's a lot of motion graphics blogs and other games. It doesn't matter what the game is. It can be like Love Nikki on the phone. Like it's like a game that you might not think is a good example. It's some cases what not to do, what to do. So I think just not being too what's the word, like discriminatory, I guess, when you're picking your inspiration for UI UX can come from anywhere. So.
And Hasiba?
Yeah, so I work on Hearthstone, and so Hearthstone UI is very like physical. Like the concept of the UI is that everything is within a deck box, a physical box itself. And so when we look at UI and how it should look like in the game, we're often looking at physical objects, like things that are mechanical, whether it's like clocks or watches, or even like old antique items. Like we'll often draw inspiration from those to kind of like come up with some of our UI patterns. I think recently, like we worked on a new feature called duels, and so the motif that we used there was a vault door. So we looked at what vault doors look like in World of Warcraft, but then we also looked at what are some vault doors that exist like in the real world that we can kind of draw inspiration from.
Yeah, so as a Hearthstone player, really the physical aspect and like having that physical feedback as well when you're placing those cards, they're definitely well known. Ashley.
Yeah, I mean, like both ladies have said, I definitely agree with looking at other games. That's definitely the first and foremost thing you look for, especially other games that are successful within the genre that you're designing for. And also just like any kind of platform that is super popular or super understood. I like often people look at Netflix. Netflix is a really great one for people to look at for one that has a lot of content. Just because, you know, that old saying, it's you don't want to redesign the wheel. If something is working for the user and it's understood and it's become kind of the norm, then it's important to understand that flow and optimize it only if it actually benefits the player. And so it's important to look at all kinds of different flows, like banking softwares, just because people know how to use it, and just like all kinds of things. So like games are part of it, but also we have so many different microsystems within our games that it's important to look at like real world applications of that same similar flow and environment.
And
Definitely exactly what Ashley said. Because I work on platform tech, our players, even though we spend all of our time working on games, our players go out and they log into Facebook and Twitter, and they log into their, to pay their rent on their apartment website or whatever it is. So there's a very famous law that I will adapt here, known as Jacob's Law, which is that your users spend the vast majority of their time not using your thing, not playing your game, not doing the whatever. So they use other people's stuff and they expect your thing to work like other people's stuff. And gradually people sort of find consensus. When you can innovate, like, and you can find that inspiration, it's amazing and it's wonderful, but it's really important to be critical of your inspiration as well. Like, are they doing it different because it actually improves it? Or is it just different, and does that difference cause confusion? So a lot of the inspiration when I find a thing, oftentimes I'll reach for a test. There's a lot of really good unmoderated user testing tools, and I'll just put them through the test and say, well, this is a really interesting login flow for this pet supply company. So I will go out and I'll request a test of people to create an account on that pet supply company and see what they think of the mechanic. So it's a very important part of inspiration.
And how did you all get started in UX and UI design? I'm sure that this is a question that you get asked a lot, but of course we want to be educational here. So we'll start with Hasiba on this one.
Yeah, I've always loved games since I was a kid. Like my dad would get games on floppy disks and we put it in and like play them. So I always had a lot of passion for it. When I was in high school, I definitely knew I wanted to work in it because I'd play games like Prince of Persia, where it felt like there was such a beautiful harmony of like different disciplines coming together to make this beautiful piece of art that is so deep and engaging and keeps you interested for so many hours. So I really wanted to be part of that, but I didn't necessarily know exactly what part of that. Just at face level, I always thought like, oh, maybe like the art side, maybe that'd be kind of cool because that's what I see. But having Asian parents, they were not so pleased to hear that art was my passion. So it kind of steered me a little bit more towards tech. And so I managed to get kind of like the best of both worlds in that when I got to college, I went into a program that kind of balanced both tech and art together. It was called Interactive Arts and Technology. And so I kind of got like a very generalist degree where I did things like I did like product design for both like physical objects as well as digital interfaces and apps. But then I also got to do a little bit of like video game UI in that program. And that was really helpful for kind of getting me into the field of like UX, where I realized that there's like a whole design going on behind how a person interfaces with a game and like the characters of that game and the screens within that game. And so that was kind of where I found my sweet point, where I could use all my generalist skills to kind of like be useful and effective at like driving a game forward.
And Hawk?
I got my started working in UI UX mostly by starting in a much smaller area. I also started in web, and then slowly
Oh wait,
pushing up.
hold up. Web, as in like SoCal web, like alumni.
Oh no,
Okay.
I started working in web design.
Okay, there's a high school that I know that was like close. I was like that is a small universe.
That would have been real small.
That would have been crazy.
But I started working on web and then slowly pushing up against the boundaries of what I was assigned to do or what I was trying to do. Like, yes, we want to do this exactly this way, but what if we made this small change? What if we tested it and it doesn't work out very well? Or the solution that we're going for is to a problem that the player has that doesn't actually get solved by web. Like web can't actually do this. So let's go meet with the product team that is responsible for that. And very slowly but surely taking where I started in the industry, which was a very junior, very low, very low position just to get in, and then trying to find ways of solving problems and using that to move into UI UX. For me, it was all about because I, like Hasiba, also have Asian parents, and they were not pleased with the idea of me going to be a designer. And I don't even know if someone went out and just said, I'm going to study UI design and then go become a UI designer. I don't know if that's even the advisable path. It was great to start in one specific area and then use solving problems for actual customers to push into what I actually ended up doing now, which is UX.
And Ashley?
Yeah, I come from a family of 6 kids, so I grew up with more games than toys already. And then I went to DigiPen for my bachelor's and pursued a bachelor's of arts in game design there. And at some point, one of my professors actually said to me, like, hey, I think the reason these rubrics are tough for you is because you are a UX designer. And I was like, oh, okay, what's that? And then he explained it to me, and we went on through all this whole like journey with there. And then also I helped him redesign some of his like curriculum. Well, I'd helped like look at them because he was like, maybe we should focus more on UX designers. And I used to create really like diegetic onboarding experiences and tutorials because I just approached these UX problems as a level designer would. And so I got hired about 2 weeks after graduation after not applying to anywhere because I was so focused on finals that I was sleeping. To Minecraft, and I started working on the recipe book immediately. And so that was my first experience, was being a UX game designer on Minecraft, which was awesome, and helping ship that on every platform because it was during the Mojang Microsoft acquisition. And from there, I've just always been a UX game designer, focusing on these like, well, how does the player want it? How can we approach these problems the way we would more as a level designer? And like, how can we create these immersive, fully diegetic experiences for the player? How can we like keep them in our experience too? Which is like a big one, especially for something like Minecraft, which is kind of designed for people to alt tab out of. But yeah, that's been me ever since.
Annalisa?
Okay, so I've always played games, so Warcraft 2 was probably the first game I got super into. And I got into the point where I had the manual and I read it cover to cover because they had history of all the clans and stuff in there. And that's where I first saw that, oh, people actually make these games. Like they had like the artists and stuff like that. So that was something I wanted to do, but where I lived, I grew up in Utah. That's not really a career path. So I went into graphic design, worked in that for a little bit, got a degree in that, decided I didn't like it, went to DigiPen also. And that's kind of where I found out that, oh, I could take my graphic design ability and transfer this to a thing I really, really want to work on and work in games. And I had a fellow classmate and friend who had a job already. He had graduated the year before, and they were looking for more UI people. And as all four of us know, it is kind of more rare to be a UI person. So the fact I even had an interest in it, he was like, hey, you should apply to this internship. So I got an internship my junior year at Zombie Studios, where I worked mostly on serious games, which is army stuff, which was really interesting because that stuff is for like training, or it's like getting kids into it, which is a little weird, but it was an interesting experience kind of working on that. And that's kind of where I started. I went from there, and because it was a small studio, I kind of did everything. I did the UI art, I worked with the game designer to do UX too. And then my next company, I also was the only one who did everything. So this job I have at Pokemon is actually the first time I have a team I'm working with. So previously it was like UX, implementation, art, all of that. And I've actually come to really enjoy the problem solving that is involved with the UX, because previously I would just skin things for people doing the UI art. And I think there's a lot of fun to be had in getting the design brief from the designers and, breaking it apart and thinking, how would this dissect into a screen? And I've come to really, really like that problem solving. So if you love problem solving, UI's for you.
Now, this question might be a little bit difficult to answer, so I'll give you this caveat. Just name one of your favorite features that you have been working on or have worked on in your career. We can start with Elisa and then work our way in reverse order.
I think my favorite thing was actually, I guess so far, on the last company I worked at Guns Up at Valkyrie Entertainment, and we were changing this for Steam. I think I'm favorite of this because I kind of won the argument we were having about it. Like I advocated for this UI experience, and they were like, okay, yeah, let's do it. But
it's like 10 times better.
Yeah, it was like our inventory system was like set up where we had this really giant thing on the side and then this really giant thing at the bottom. So the actual window for your inventory was like maybe 2 rows, which is like not great when you're looking at inventory. So I advocated for moving stuff, the bottom thing, all into the right. And it's like, it's so basic and I don't think anyone noticed, but I felt like because we didn't have a lot of players that would comment on the UI, obviously. But I won that argument and everyone agreed it looked better. And so that's why it's a little petty, but that's my favorite thing.
And Ashley?
I have to say, still to date, it's the onboarding experience for Minecraft. It was just such a unique problem being on so many different platforms and having such a wide user base. I've still worked on lots of cool things since. That's not to say that things just like peak at a point, because there's lots of cool things, but that was a very unique problem set, and it was really cool.
Hawk?
I think when I still worked on web, I worked on an esports website for a game that we put out called Heroes of the Storm. And the thing that I loved about that site was it wasn't about here's what the program wants to show. It had a lot of the player who is coming in we want them to be able to watch esports the way that they watch ESPN, and here's what our competitors do, here's what our competitors in soccer leagues do, here's what Netflix does to encourage behaviors, and taking all that information and just make a really good esports experience. And like Ashley, I worked on lots of cool stuff since. I think my favorite project is still always the project that I just finished, and everything before that is garbage. But I'm still pretty proud of that esports website because I think it really helped a lot of people, even though the product doesn't exist anymore.
And can you tell us more about like your most recent project, since that's your favorite?
I absolutely cannot.
Of course, it's Riot. I didn't even know why I asked, but
That's what I was thinking. I'm like, oh, your new project, but you can never say anything about your project you're currently working on.
I do know that y'all will see some stuff soon, but no, I can't tell you anything about it.
Well, as a League player, I really hope it has something to do with the client, so fingers crossed. And going over to Hasiba.
Yeah, shout out to HGC. I also worked on that. That's also got a special place in my heart. Always love it. In terms of favorite projects, it's always typically the most recent one is the one that you're most proudest of, because like Hawk said, everything before that can sometimes feel like garbage. But yeah, my most recent project on Hearthstone was the progression revamp of the reward system. That was really cool because it was kind of like a system-wide change. So I got to touch a couple of different places and kind of come into the game that's been around for like almost 7 years with fresh eyes and be like, okay, what can we do with this? What sort of changes do we want to really, make this entire holistic experience feel solid? So with the progression revamp, one of the main features I worked on was the battle pass. And the battle pass is something that's been done in a lot of other games. And there are certain conventions that are used in those games that we kind of had to look at and be like, should we lean on convention or should we try to lean a bit more on like Hearthstone flavor instead? And so it was definitely a balancing act in terms of like say even with like a level bar, should we make it like a standard level bar? Should we give it a theme, like it's some kind of like magical liquid or something, or give it some kind of like special name? And ultimately the theme that we kind of ended up leaning on was to make the actual battle pass feel like a map that can be like physically scrolled, like it's got scrolls. And so we use that icon to also represent XP in the game. And so it tries to create that connection through this metaphor that like anything map related is the battle pass. And so if you see that icon, you know exactly what it's referring to. We also had to like be considerate that like with XP, it's such an abstract word and concept. Like, how do you visually represent XP? Some games do it where like you just write literally XP, but then other games like they might just do like something a little more pretty or like abstract. And so we ended up just deciding to use that visual language of like, this is a map scroll, that is our XP points.
Yeah, it sounds like a lot of thought, and there's an entire process into these features. How long would you say it generally takes to work a UI or a UX feature from concept to final product? And we'll start with Hasiba on this one.
I think it really depends on what you're working on, because some tasks will be like major feature overhauls, like what I just mentioned with like our battle pass. That's like a huge feature that took multiple months. But some things can also be like small quality of life improvements that we'll do. Like say, for instance, sometimes we'll get a request about an accessibility problem that people are experiencing. And so that'll be something that maybe only takes a UI designer like a couple days to a week to figure out before we start actually like implementing into the game. So it really depends on the scope of the feature.
And Hawk?
It does definitely depend. I think that there are usually two buckets that my work will fall into. One is very deep thought project work or work that touches a lot of things. One of my focuses at Riot is login, is how do you log into everything that you log into that Riot makes, which might be games, it might be websites, it might be all those things. But the number of systems that it touches and the number of mediums, mobile, console, desktop games, mobile games that you have to consider. It means that that's a very deep problem with a lot of technical implementation. So maybe that project takes, even to make a small change, might take several months because you have to circle all the wagons, make sure that you haven't made a horrible mistake. And then in Riot's case, because we publish in so many countries, sometimes our work has to be interpreted through this region has this requirement for login, that region has a different requirement, this region on that device. It's a lot of variables. But then the second bucket is what I think of as um, fast React work. So that's usually something like there is a major problem here, or there's a very low hanging fruit there, or I want to do some really fast testing, or I want to learn more about our players. And that type of work might be a month at most, maybe even just a few days. For designers, I think one thing that's changed as I moved over time is less thinking about a lot of my work as well. I start the work, I have my kickoff meeting, and then at the end I've shipped it, and then I test it. And it's just one constant thing. And what it's actually become is I'm doing much smaller versions or pieces of that all at the same time and just threading them through my year. So by the end of it, I have achieved maybe like 5 or 6 different projects over time, but I wasn't doing them all like start and stop as I go. I weave them together so that I can deliver a lot of player success without having to like risk that I'm on the wrong thing at any one point.
Mhm. And Ashley?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what everyone said. Also, I think it hugely depends on whether you're working on a live product or not. And it depends then on whether the feature is something kind of like what we were saying before, which is pretty much totally inspired by a pre-existing visual language or user flow that everyone knows, or whether it's like this is the feature that's going to drive our players. This is the feature that we know our players are coming for, so we're going to spend a way longer time spend like figuring out what we really want to do here and what really is the right choice.
And Elisa?
I would say, personally, if we were talking about like how long it would take, like task wise, I'd say art is way quicker for me. It's a lot quicker to if someone's like, you need a mock up, I'm like, yeah, you got that. But if they're like, please design this system using the game design, that's gonna be like, I need my headphones on, I need music, no one can distract me. Like it's like you gotta problem solve out of it. But if we're talking about like team wise, I would say yeah, it definitely depends on whether it's live, is a really great point, or whether you're prototyping things. So I would say I have a lot of experience doing the prototyping phase, and that's where things can take months. Like you're kind of working in tandem with the designer. So you will solve the thing they're doing, but then it's like design has changed. And so you could take like I would say even like a year or so to get everything figured out for this huge game, like huge front-facing user feature that's so important to the main flow of the game, and they can decide like what they want, and you need to keep showing them things. So it kind of depends on like whether you're working as the design is being made, the game design is being made, or whether it's like people have already committed and had the design figured out, and then comes to you as the UX designer. I would say it's a lot quicker if it's already been figured out and you're not figuring it out as you go. But yeah, it definitely depends on the scope of the project. I would say at a lot of the stuff on smaller studios, it's been both, because again, it's really whether the design has been figured out solidly firsthand, because it's mostly iteration at that point. Like a lot of iteration is where you get to.
Gotcha. And then with these prototyping processes and just working on it in general, are there any software or applications that you would suggest inspiring UX and UI designers to know? And we can go back in the same order, starting with Hasiba.
Oh, there is like an infinite number of different kinds of software you can use for design. I mean, you could use Paint for design if you really want, but in terms of what we actually use, what I personally use these days is Photoshop as well as Illustrator. I just find that like generally all my designers tend to be in the Adobe ecosystem. And so like I'll do my wireframes in Illustrator just because I'm like a power user in Illustrator and I'm obsessed with Illustrator. And then when I get into the visual side of it, I'll start doing mockups where it actually looks like the real UI in Photoshop. And then if I'm trying to demonstrate like animation or transitions or like complex interactions, then for prototyping tools, what I'll use is sometimes I'll use After Effects. And I'll do that for like, say, something very like graphical, visual, VFXy, to kind of display that proof of concept. But if it's more of like screen to screen to screen flow, then I'll use a prototyping tool. Like right now I use Proto.io, which has been pretty powerful in terms of like showing very like clear transitions between screens and like this is how you click around and how you navigate through the app. So those have been kind of my current go-tos.
And Hawk.
First, I'd like to compliment Hasiba on her After Effects because it is legendary. I always loved looking at Hasiba's motion comps just to embarrass her a little bit on the spot. For design, Riot is predominantly a Figma studio. So Figma is a great new tool that kind of came out of nowhere actually while we were all focused on Sketch. But there are a million tools. I like the breakdown into design and prototyping. Um, the important thing is that a design app it's just a tool, so just use the one that gets you the thing that you're trying to do. They're tools, not musical instruments. You're not perfecting them or becoming like a master at these things for the purpose of using the tool. It needs to do something for you. For Figma, I will also do quick prototypes in it, but if I'm going to do something more complex, then I will usually go into Framer. Framer is a tool that you can use for prototyping that is backed by React.js. So if you work in web, it's also a really good option because you can use a lot of your knowledge about how websites are built to use Framer. And you can also build more complex prototypes. I'd say that Framer is probably a more advanced app because it requires a lot more. It requires a lot more know-how. And then on top of that, I've used ProtoPie, Proto.io, the Adobe Suite, Sketch, Principle, all the things.
Ashley.
Yeah, I mean, like everyone said, there's a million tools and they're all pretty much the same. I think what's important here, like just with the two people who have gone before me, is the exact differences in their roles. Like being a more visual person, you're going to be more focused on like visual tools like the Adobe Suite and the After Effects. Being a more user-centric person, like user flow person, you're going to be focused on user flow tools such as Sketch, Figma, XD. And it really doesn't matter which one you learn. You just need to learn one of them and then you'll kind of quickly get the other one. Miro is another one people use a lot now, or Envision. Also, this will apply outside of games. If you were looking at XD or UX positions or UI positions in other like platforms outside of like games, they're going to be using Sketch, Envision, the Adobe Suite. But I also think it matters on the size of your team. So when you're working more on the AAA time, you're going to be using more like user flow softwares as a UX designer. I'll just speak for myself right now. Like you're going to be using more Figma, Miro, Sketch, maybe even Lucid Charts or Google Drawings or just your pen and paper. That's like my favorite. But but if you're on a smaller team, you might actually have to implement those things within Unity. You might actually have to start doing these tests yourself. You might actually have to do your own assets as well. So I do think it's important to, like, even if you don't think like, hey, I don't think UX design is really like that involved in the engine, like just use it because it's a really ill-defined field. Like all of us will say that, like, there's a super ill-defined field, and like that gray line is just like the more you can know about these tools will, one, make you a better UX designer because you actually understand your limits better and you understand how to communicate with other parts of your team, which is probably your most beneficial tool as a UX designer. And also it'll make you stronger. Like if you can know any tool and you can pick up any tool faster with the more you learn, you understand more and more. And it's just highly recommend to like learn whatever you can.
And Elisa.
I would say I'm actually the opposite of Hasiba. I love Photoshop. So I do everything in Photoshop. That's the one I've had the most experience in. But yeah, I would say it kind of doesn't matter what the program is. Find one that's you're comfortable with, and if you produce good work out of it, nobody really cares unless you're at a studio that's like, we need this one, like Riot with Figma or something like that. But honestly, if you learn one of these softwares, it's not difficult to transfer that knowledge over to a different one. So just pick one you like. For example, like my very first job, I mostly worked at small studios. Pokemon's the first place I worked at as a larger studio. And at those small studios, you tend to do everything. So I did implementation, I did art, I did design, I did wireframes. And what I did was I literally drew my wireframes in Photoshop with the brush tool because I couldn't figure out vectors of shapes at the time. And then I would just take that and like work on top of that. And people were fine with it because the work I was doing was what they needed. And I also done prototypes in Flash, formerly Flash, currently Adobe Animate. That's probably my favorite one to prototype in because I'm experienced with it because I can do the click-throughs with the really basic scripting they have. But I'd say for right now my process is probably mockups in XD, click-through mockups, and then if that's agreed on, I will go into Photoshop and just do the whole thing over it. And if I need to make anything vector, I will go into Illustrator. So it's kind of what you become comfortable with. I've used Photoshop since it was Photoshop Elements, Photoshop 3. So I haven't very experienced in Photoshop, but if you aren't very experienced with Photoshop, if you're not comfortable with it and you're experienced with another program, you just really need to like produce good work out of it. That's really all it is. It's like, art, like which medium you're going to pick, which medium you're most comfortable in. There's no one medium you need to pick. It's just more like the skills that you can apply to it. Oh, and I will echo what Ashley said about implementation. When I actually started putting things into Unreal or Unity, I learned a lot about what the limitations of that program were, which really helped when you're creating art and UX, because if you think, oh, I want to do this really cool like explosion-y thing, but you don't have anyone on your team who can actually like do the FX to that point, and you can't do the FX, maybe just scale that back a little bit.
Of course.
Yeah.
Now we are at our last question before we open it up to the chat. And so this one's going to start with Elisa answering. And that question is, what is your skill set when it comes to UI and UX work? AKA, what are your tools of the trade?
Does that mean like what I would put on my resume? Is that what that?
Or what skills do you use as everyday in your role?
Okay. I would say I have an illustration background, so I use a lot of that kind of color theory, a lot of color theory things, especially when you're doing the final art. A little bit of psychology. I didn't actually go to school for UX, but if you think about the way people respond to things being on the left or right, or whether we have the X in the corner, or how people think about the color red in certain countries, things like that. So a little bit of color theory. I would say my graphic design skills and spatial knowledge, where it's like, you got a header in this thing and cohesiveness and aesthetics. I don't know if that answers the question, but it's probably my graphic design stuff is what I rely on the most.
Oh yes, that definitely answers the question. Yeah, no worries. And Ashley?
Yeah, I'm going to give a really weird answer for this because it's kind of a really hard thing to answer as a UX designer. But if you can think of any moment that you've watched someone or you've used something and been like, what the actual F is going on right now? Like, that's the skill set a UX designer has. Like, I know that sounds so silly, but
no, I totally agree with you.
Yeah, knowing that actually, that's your number one skill as a UX designer. I always tell this story in interviews. my sister calls me the dumbest smart person she knows, which sounds like an insult, but it's my sister, so it's not. But it's my superpower as a UX designer. This is what I say is my number one skill as a UX designer. Because being able to take a situation and approach it as just like, no, each point that's confusing, each point that's like, maybe that's not coming across. And like, that's going to be your driving force. Watch when people rage quit. Watch when people are like, wait, what do you mean close it? Watch when people are like, how do I punch? Like anything like that. Or like, wait, there's skills in this game? Like any moment like that. That's your superpower.
It seems like super listening almost even.
Yeah, Alyssa touched on it. I'm sorry, but Alyssa touched on it really quickly. But I'm in grad school for UX design, and so I'm learning these principles after practicing them. And Hawk actually touched on it earlier when he was talking about the laws of UX. But that psychology behind like player like actions is super crucial.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. Yeah, that really does explain it in like the best way possible. Hawk.
That's a really great answer. Because, like Ashley mentioned in her previous one, UX is really ill-defined. Like the field didn't exist a number of years ago, and then the first 3 or 4 variations meant like UI or art or mockups or make it pretty, make it pop. So it's kind of shifted over time. Um, Everything that Ashley said about testing and watching players. If you've ever helped your mom use her iPhone or you've helped a relative set up their Wi-Fi and they just can't get it, imagine doing that for 8 hours a day, every day, and you are a usability tester. And you will make really bulletproof Wi-Fi apps if given the chance. Um, if I could add my own skill set, I think the thing that I do most of all at Riot is try to understand how I can bring the people that work in the company and the people that don't work for the company but use our products to the same place. I spend a lot of time advocating for the player and negotiating with internal people. So that I think is my best skill set, is trying to bring everybody to the same point of what we want the player to feel this, and we have these limitations and these constraints. Can I come up with a product design decision that lives in a place where everybody is happy, or at least sufficiently happy for this first version? And then how can I bump it over into player, and then bump it more over into player, and bump it more over into player, and move it over time? Because a lot of what we do as UX designers is not in a vacuum. Like the thing has to work with the game designer, it has to work with the engineering, it has to be doable, it has to work in an engine that we don't own if we're using a third party. It has to work in all these different cases, and then also be, a good business model. It has to work for in different regions around the world. We have to be conscious of the Eastern point of view, the Western point of view, everything in the middle. And because of that, that's a really important part for UX to stand, is because we have to be that bridge between folks that might otherwise not talk to each other. So I think that's what I spend most of my time doing at Riot, when I'm not just watching people fail on camera, which is fun.
That must be very entertaining, because I know from personal experience that at least League of Legends players are very vocal and very passionate about aspects of the game, and I'm sure that overlaps with your work. So
Player
you're a
feedback
champion to the people.
It's amazing. Like players will always tell us when they're confused by anything, about any aspect of anything. And I think anyone that works for a game studio of a certain size or larger is used to a barrage of feedback coming at you at all times. And when it's done, when it's done angrily, there's something you can pull out of it, but generally there's always something good in the feedback. There was a designer, a senior designer when I was at Blizzard, who used to say that customers or players, whoever, are really bad at identifying the solution, at telling you what you should do to fix the problem, but they're really good at zeroing in on the fact that there is a problem. So even when they're being rude to you, you should still listen to them, because what they're feeling is real.
It's a good life lesson to learn. And Asiva?
Yeah, I think there's definitely like hard skills and soft skills that are very important. For hard skills, I personally really love like the design aspect of like concepting, like what are we even doing? Why are we doing it? Should we even do it? And then like iterating on like different versions of what that kind of looks like and could be. Like that really blue sky concepting is something that I just like thrive off of. Um, and then when it comes, I also have like I have strong skills with implementing, but that's not necessarily my passion. And then when it comes to art, like I'll do it to like do it, but it's not going to be like the number one priority for me. Like it's definitely still like design and like design the thing, come up with the thing. In terms of soft skills, that's also really important because a big part of designing is listening to what other people are telling you and interpreting that into a solution that kind of like prioritizes different things. So I always feel like there is no perfect design ever. You're always making compromises of some sort. Someone's always going to be unhappy, and you kind of have to like pick and choose like what are the elements that I'm going to prioritize in different designs and what are the reasons why I'm going to stand by this and, you know, try to convince the rest of my team that this is the route to go. So it's a lot of like communication and making sure that we can all kind of get onto a similar page of like, this is the way forward.
Thank you. And now we're going to open it up to audience questions. And the first audience question that we have, and we'll just go in the same order that we just did, is the panelists have talked about problem sets or constraints when working on the various projects. What are some common problem sets or constraints that UI and UX devs and artists face in development? So you can just give like maybe a couple of examples. I'm sure that there's many to choose from. We'll start with Elisa.
Sorry, I was trying to remember the previous one. I would say I think it kind of varies on being on a very small team where it's you know, you kind of have one person doing each thing. For that one, a lot of the problems were honestly like time. So we would come up with an idea or a design and then spend a really long time discussing it. And then once we got to our milestone, we had a little bit of time to implement it. So I think a lot of it is kind of like having the too many cooks in the kitchen kind of deal. I like having everyone have an opinion, but at least with the smaller teams I'm on, it's a lot easier to come kind of, you're trying to please everybody. And so time becomes an issue because you're like, well, I want to do this mock-up to address the new feedback that we've just gotten, but the milestone's ending soon. Which do we want? And then I would say a big difficulty, I think, or I guess a hurdle, not really a bad thing, is the quality over. A lot of the stuff I run into is we'll be coming to the end of a goal or something like that, and you, especially being on a small team, I've implemented a bunch of stuff, but it's not necessarily art. It's not necessarily at quality level, and so you kind of have to pick whether you are going what point you're going to get to. You can't really be a perfectionist, which is hard for me because I'm innately a perfectionist. So you need to just kind of be like, this looks good enough, and let's move on. I would say on a larger team, I think a lot of it is the most difficult thing is probably when you put something in and it doesn't work and you can't figure out why, and then it's like the 11th hour. So don't do stuff at the 11th hour. Don't be me. And I would say communication too, like understanding a feature. It's not hard in a bad way, but it's hard in the fact that you absolutely need to have those conversations. So if you're working on a team where a designer puts forth the design team puts forth the design, and then you're like, okay, go do the thing, and you read the document and you're confused. Don't just start working on it being confused. You need to discuss it, especially now when we're all working from home. Like, just set up a call with them or something, and don't be afraid of asking questions, and don't be afraid of, you know, being stupid, like Ashley was saying. Like, you need to ask those questions. You need to clarify. No one's going to think you're stupid for asking those questions, and I think that's really hard to get over, especially when you're new to the industry or when you're new to a role. Or for my case, I started at my job in March and don't want to don't know what they're talking about. But you definitely, as the UX designer, you are the one bridging those gaps with the questions, and so you're asking the questions that players later will have. So I guess I kind of came around about and said it's actually really hard realizing you don't know anything sometimes.
And thank you so much, Elisa. So we do have a couple more larger questions. So I want to give time for those questions to be answered as well. So this one is, what's something that you wish that you had known starting out as a UX designer that you would tell new designers? And we'll start with Ashley on this one.
Man, this is kind of tricky because I started out as a game designer. I already started out thinking about the player and the player's needs, which is like that's the number one thing, the player's needs, right? But I do think that something I have noticed that people lose is inclusive design. I really think the power of inclusive design is like everything, and when we don't design with that in mind, it really shows. And I think things like color blindness, like that's such a huge one. And it's really, people don't think about those kinds of like it's really our job as UX and UI people together to design these experiences that work for them. And so things like just trying to remember that you're not designing an experience just for you. You're designing an experience for everyone, which also means like, you know, you can't have you got to have thick skin. Like that's like really crucial. Like you have to be willing to ask questions. You have to be willing to like work together. It's important that you are communicating your designs effectively. We touched on that a little when we talked about tools, but the most important thing is that no matter what tool you're using to lay out your design is laid out. And then people can understand it and iterate on it with you, because it's an experience for everyone, and everyone on your team cares about the games we make, and they're representative of the players, and only a small subset too. So that's important to remember too. But yeah, I don't even know if that really answered your question, but that's my answer.
And Hawk?
I would say when you work in UX, a lot of stuff is coming at you, like implementation and constraints, and it tested badly, and like how do I place everything so it's understandable, and the aesthetics of it. Like there's so many aspects of it. So one of the things I always recommend to new people getting into UX UI is to do a lot of stuff for the purpose of making your craft, whatever your craft is, graphic, UX, testing, making that second nature to you. So if I need to sit down and okay, I need to do a form that is going to be, or a settings panel for a privacy and security setting. I can't spend a lot of time thinking about like, what is the proper UX for this form? What are the standard conventions for this? How do I use the design tool I'm using? Like, I can't be thinking about all those things. I'm trying to solve a complex problem, and I need my brain to be on that, and for everything else to just come out of my hands naturally. So the best thing I did in the early part of my career was I would do a thing called copy work. Um, Anyone that's gone to art school may have done this before, or if you've been to an art museum and you see people standing there painting the great master's work, it's where you literally just take a piece of UI that you like and you recreate it in a tool. Or do usability tests for everything if that's the thing you want to specialize in, so that when it comes time to, I need to do a usability test for this banking application, I don't need to think about how do I make a UX test. I just know how to do it, and I can just put my brain on the banking app part of it. So do a lot of stuff so that you don't have to think about it, because it becomes so practiced.
And thank you. And Hasiba?
I really like what Hawk said about like copying. Like I think when you jump into any kind of style of UI or like medium, it's always great to look at what other people are doing and just try to see if you could like one-to-one emulate that. But keep that private, of course. It's just a learning experience. But otherwise, I also think what's really important and sometimes a little under talked about in UI is being able to talk about your designs effectively and convincing people that it's the right way to go. You're often going to be doing pitching of ideas. Like, say, for instance, a project comes to you where it's like, okay, we have this problem, we need a design for it, go. And so there may be some preconceived expectations of what the solution will probably be. You as a designer kind of have to look at that problem, really dissect it, and then come back with a solution that really considers the user value, the business value, all balanced out, and also what the team can actually execute on. And you have to come back with a pitch of like, okay, this is how I've interpreted that problem, and here's my solution for it. And sometimes that pitch will be very expensive. So you got to be really good at selling that concept of why this is really valuable and important for us to pursue. So being able to articulate a story for your design, especially when you talk from the user perspective, is really important.
And then going off of that, do you draw any type of inspiration between from technology or UX side of games? I know that you all said social media beforehand, but were there any others? Consensus nod, yeah. All right.
I mean, just any platform that's really popular. And like we said, any platform that's really understood. Like, that's why we gave mobile banking as an example, or like Uber, or like anything that people know how to use instantly. Google Maps has become such the norm for how GPS maps work that pretty much if your map doesn't look like Google Maps, people don't know how to use it. So it's like noticing powers or like trends like that is super crucial.
Especially when
Amazon.
Google.
Yeah, Amazon.
Yeah.
Amazon, yeah.
One thing I want to add as a last minute, like quick note to anyone aspiring to be a designer of any type, but especially UX or UI, is like, don't be afraid to fail and fail often, because failing is actually how you get to a successful design. And it actually is a really good thing because it pinpoints where your problem is. It's like literally how you build that stairs to get to the design.
Thank you so much for y'all and your answers. They've been beautiful, and I'm actually this really blown away as a person who had no idea what UX or UI was before researching for this panel. I am truly impressed with your work and very thankful for what you all do, and I'm sure the chat is as well. But unfortunately, we are at the end of this panel. Thank you so much for your time. And give out some hype for our amazing panelists as well. This is it was just great. And friendly reminder is that we are still taking donations for our causes, Black Girls Code, Code 2040, and Direct Relief from Tiltify. So you can register and using the command donate or check out the Discord for more information. And before we go to our commercial break, a quick message from our sponsors. Allmid runs and supports a nationally supported community, collegiate, and convention esports around the US since 2015. Their esports teams are also currently ranked Division 1 and top 10 in the North America field. I have a cat right in front of me while I'm talking. And Corsair, the leading developer and manufacturer of high-performance gear and technology for gamers, content creators, and PC enthusiasts. And TESPA, the largest collegiate network of college students, competitors, and club leaders across North America. Thank you to all of our panelists, and everyone wave goodbye. We're going to commercial.
Sean Andalcio. My gamer tag is Mandalcio. Really involved in League of Legends.
Hi everybody, I'm Leslie O'Neill. I work with the Akron Summit Convention and Visitors Bureau.
I'm Chris Volpe, the president of Multivarious, a game development studio in Columbus, Ohio. I'm also the president and founder of the Ohio Game Developer Association and the executive director and founder of GDEX.
Hi, my name is Alex Valkyrie. I'm a two-time national champion in the HSCL.
So my name is Jess Brohard, and as a profession, I'm an esports event host. I recently was doing the stage hosting, interviewing, and sideline reporting for the Call of Duty World League, now called the Call of Duty League.
So I play League of Legends for the University of Cincinnati.
My very first game was Super Mario Brothers on a Game Boy. So I've been involved in games for a really long time.
I started playing video games probably when I was around 4 or 5 years old. Started out with the GameCube.
So the game that got me interested in competitive esports was Rocket League. I started playing and I got hooked to the game. I play soccer, so I just kept playing the game over and over again, and I realized, hey, I'm getting pretty good.
So for some reason, Team Fortress 2 was like one of the games that I played in college that just really like got me excited to play like versus other people instead of just, because of course I love single player games and Final Fantasy and all that, but what really sparked that competitive edge in me was TF2.
I've actually grown up my entire life playing traditional sports.
I think you can apply some of the same fundamentals and some of the same best practices as far as team building.
They're definitely different. Traditional sports, I think, just have a sort of place in like human psyche and tradition and society.
The only thing that is missing is the physical aspect, but if you take sports like chess, there isn't really that much of a physical aspect in chess.
Teamwork, discipline, and practicing, and just feeling inclusive and part of something bigger.
As esports grows, you just keep seeing, oh, that's something that traditional sports already does. And it's kind of following a similar model, but also being its own.
I think the biggest difference is probably the level of balkanization. So for example, in America, our big three sports are what? Like basketball, baseball, football, right? Right now we got a Smash tournament outside, but the fighting game community has Tekken, has Mortal Kombat, has all sorts of things, right? And that's just one genre for the fighting game community.
It's less physical than traditional sports and contact sports, I guess. So it's less contact, but the mental stamina that it takes to compete, I think equally, it would be as equal to the mental stamina it would take to compete physically, if not more.
And a lot of kids get made fun of for being bad at sports or not being able to run fast or jump high. They're not as adept with that, but they may be twice as good as anybody else at esports or at any kind of video game. And I think it just fills that niche of everybody belongs somewhere, and I think esports is a place for a lot of people.
It's gonna grow, obviously. I don't think it'll ever replace like traditional sports.
The future of esports is so hard to predict because we've seen so many things that have worked so well and then so many things that have not worked as well.
I think the future's already here. I think the writing is it's clear that esports is going to be coming in. The viewership is huge. When you look at almost every other sporting event, the viewership is on par, if not better.
So I think millennials were like the first generation where the internet was like, just like a part of the environment, right? I think as they grow older and Gen Z and whoever comes next, right, gaming and competitive sports is on, through e-gaming, right, whatever, is just gonna be more of a part of life. Right. So I don't think it'll ever replace it, but I think it's just gonna be like a growing thing, right? Games are everywhere, from consoles to computers to, our cell phones.
I think over the next 5 years, we'll definitely see a true economic impact on the community once we just continue to raise brand awareness or raise awareness of brand partnerships and creating those relationships. I think we'll definitely see, significant growth and impact.
You're starting to see a lot of really interesting player dynamics, a lot of sponsorship opportunities, and you're beginning to see collegiate involvement, which is always big, trying to figure that out. So I think the next 3 to 5 years is going to be a foundational time for what esports will look like for the next 50.
What is my favorite thing about esports?
Oh gosh, the excitement in the room when players, no matter what level, whether you're pro, semi-pro, amateur, you're just playing for fun. Every sports event that I've attended, the energy in the room from the fans and just the competition component of it, it's exciting.
I have friends who live in California or who live in Michigan or who live in Wisconsin, and it's not easy to get a plane out to Wisconsin, right? But maybe, every other weekend we can get together and play some league.
Esports communities make the world feel a lot smaller and a lot more manageable because you have your little community of people who enjoy watching or playing the same game that you do, and even if they're from Finland and you're from California, you can still kind of be brought together and unified over this game that you love.
I think the hype that you don't get from sports like soccer. Like scoring a goal is hype, but you only score like a goal or two a game, and that's over the course of 90 minutes. A Rocket League game takes 5 minutes, and I get just that equal amount of hype in 5 minutes versus 90 minutes.
I think my favorite thing is just how new it is. I've always been a really big fan. I like to jump into the pool where nobody really knows what's going on. And esports is so new that people are trying to figure it out. There's no answers for these things, right?